Tonight I want to explore the role of African Americans in the effort to win British popular support for the Union during the Civil War. This is an effort that went back almost 30 years, beginning in the 1830s, as an effort, as that kind of international effort, to rally international support for the emancipation of slaves in the United States. And it is that sort of theme that I want to explore today. As most in British textile industry lay idle in the summer of 1863, a forced inactivity brought on by the loss of cotton supplies from the southern states, the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, the black Presbyterian minister, wrote Peter Sinclair, a Scot who had emigrated to the United States, but now was back in Britain on a mission to undermine support for the Confederacy. He wrote Sinclair, "Every black man in America, whether bond or free, has been filled with alarm at the bare possibility of our beloved and venerated England acknowledging the independence of the Southern Confederacy, whose chief cornerstone is slavery." Meant in part to flatter his readers, Garnett, like so many others, was also concerned that Britain was drifting away from a tradition that had done so much to sustain the struggle against slavery and discrimination in the United States. These sentiments were written for public consumption and, as Garnett anticipated, were published in many British newspapers in the summer and fall of 1863 as the public debate over which side in the war to support was at its most intense. Almost simultaneously, Frederick Douglass, this man on the wall here, there's an interesting story. This is the Solidarity Wall on the Falls Road in Belfast. And this is the Douglass mural that is the centerpiece of that Solidarity Wall. It says something about the reach of Douglass particularly, but also of other African Americans dating back to the 19th century and their efforts to try and rally Irish support for emancipation in the United States, an effort which I should add largely failed. Almost simultaneously, Frederick Douglass wrote a series of letters to a Leeds supporter, well aware that they too would be made public. Douglass wrote, "You and your side of the Atlantic can do vast and important service by keeping a wakeful eye upon our affairs and the course of events here, and by administering a word of timely admonition when you see us halting between truth and treason." Both Garnett and Douglass were drawing from the same well of public opinion that had informed the transatlantic abolitionist movement since the emancipation of slaves in the British West Indies in 1834. But in the wake of the outbreak of hostilities in the United States, many saw signs that the anti-slavery wall that Garnett, Douglass, and other African Americans had constructed over 30 years of agitation were beginning to show signs of wear. Supporters of the Confederacy were chipping away at its foundations by making a concerted effort to rally public opinion on their side in the hope that the British government would recognize its independence. In the weeks after the firing of Fort Sumter, the Confederacy dispatched emissaries to London and France to persuade European governments to recognize its independence, to procure arms and ships for its army and navy, and to raise the level of awareness about the true causes of the war among the public. It is in the crucial effort to influence British public opinion that African Americans would come to play a pivotal role. African Americans, as unofficial emissaries, were up to the challenge. During the war, there were at one time or another close to 50 of them involved in the public debate over the war. Developments in the United States, particularly the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, had prompted many to seek safety in Britain. Many of them, such as William Powell of New York, who had always been free, saw the law as the ultimate expression of the country's unwillingness to grant blacks the rights of citizenship. Powell moved his family to England soon after its passage, announcing, "I have decided to remove to another country where my children..." I am impressed. At important points, the roll of thunder is just for dramatic effect. "I have decided to remove to another country where my children will not, because of their color alone, be compelled to fight the battle of life at a disadvantage, which I too well know how to appreciate. I do not feel I will be discharging my parental duty by retaining them in a land which, though theirs by birth, makes them alien to the protection of its laws and the benefits of its social relations." But the majority who went into exile, such as William and Ellen Craft, were fugitive slaves who chose to put some distance between themselves and their former masters. Soon after the act was signed into law in September 1850, 2 slave catchers from Georgia turned up in Boston in search of the Crafts. Their dramatic escape over the Christmas holidays 2 years earlier had captured the imagination of the country. Ellen, who looked white, was disguised as a slave master traveling north for medical reasons, accompanied by her personal slave, her husband, William. They traveled by a combination of trains and boats from Macon, Georgia, arriving in Philadelphia 4 days later. They would later settle in Boston, where they thought they would be safer. For those committed to the enforcement of the new fugitive slave law, their recapture would have represented a terrible blow to the abolitionist movement that supported them, as well as confirm the federal government's determination to enforce the law and hopefully appease those who saw the law as the last best chance to keep the Union together. Although the Boston black community and the abolitionist supporters rallied to the defense of the Crafts and prevented their recapture, it was thought best they leave the country. Between their arrival in Britain in 1851 and the outbreak of the war 10 years later, they attended school, were married and started a family, settled in London where they ran a number of small businesses and were a regular fixture of the anti-slavery lecture circuit. They came to symbolize both the failure of America to live up to the freedom's promise, as well as the determination of the oppressed to be free. There were so many other escaped slaves in Britain in this time that an organization of fugitive slaves was formed in London to promote their interests and needs. Powell, the Crafts, William Wells Brown, J.W.C. Pennington, Garnett, Alexander Crummell, and a host of other African Americans, free blacks and former slaves, some seeking safety, others an education, and still others raising money for different abolitionist causes, had long been the backbone of the transatlantic movement. It is this presence and the alliance they helped to forge, what Benjamin Quarles describes as a duet, a harmonizing of interests, which appealed to British public opinion to morally isolate the United States and to pressure it to abolish slavery. It was this association and its wide-ranging public agitation, Quarles suggests, which in the long run worked against the possibility of Britain recognizing the Confederacy. My aim tonight is to explore Quarles's intriguing suggestion, fully aware that under the conditions of war, appeals to international public opinion, and especially so in the case of Britain, which had a long and sometimes troubled association with the United States, was fraught with all sorts of problems. The picture is scrambled even more because of the centrality of the textile industry to the British economy and its almost total reliance on American cotton, which made it particularly vulnerable to any sustained fluctuation in supplies. The dangers of over-reliance on American cotton worried Lancashire and Cheshire textile manufacturers so much that by the mid-1850s, they formed a Cotton Supply Association with the express purpose of promoting cotton cultivation in other parts of the world, in Africa, the Caribbean, and in India. When the cotton famine finally hit in late 1862, throwing thousands out of work and bringing to near starvation families who relied on the wages of cotton workers, there were widespread calls for the recognition of the Confederacy as the only guaranteed way to ensure the resumption of trade. Not surprisingly, it is at the center of the textile industry, in places where the cotton famine had its most devastating impact, that the most sustained public debate over the causes and consequences of the war occurred. Confronted by such economic devastation, those opposed to recognition appealed to the tradition of anti-slavery cooperation that Quarles identified. Anti-slavery, they insisted, was a recognized and valued part of Britain's patrimony. In fact, there was some wag who suggested that he got his anti-slavery through his mother's milk. How could a nation that had built much of its humanitarian reputation on its decision to abolish slavery in its West Indian colonies 30 years before support an effort to establish a country that was expressly built on slavery? It would be retrograde at a time when every European nation had abolished, or in the case of Russia, was soon to abolish, its system of unfree labor. Opponents of recognition had an additional hurdle to overcome in the first year of the war: the Lincoln administration's insistence that the war was not being fought to free the slaves, only to reunite the country. In spite of Britain's declaration of neutrality in the spring of 1862, no one was certain what this said about the government's future intentions. Was it a prelude to recognition of the Confederacy, or was it a final declaration of the government's intention not to become involved in the war? In a political system in which few had the vote, policy was the exclusive preserve of a small group of individuals, many of them beneficiaries of a political system that limited the vote to a relatively small number of its citizens. But policy could be influenced, as it had been in the struggle over West Indian emancipation, Catholic emancipation, and other major reforms enacted by Parliament over the last 40 years, by organized pressure or the voice of the people from without. For those opposed to slavery and the continual denial of rights to African Americans, appeals directly to the British public, a sort of people-to-people diplomacy, which went around established governments, seemed to be the only way of raising public awareness to a point where it could not be ignored by the government. This was the approach adopted by all those in the public debate over the war. The Confederate government, through its representatives in London and Liverpool, hired a number of agents to make its case. So too did the Union. But pro-Union forces were slow to organize, and when they did, came to rely heavily on the scores of African Americans who were in Britain at the outset of the war, or who came specifically to promote the cause. Those who were there before the commencement of hostilities quickly turned their attention to the war. Among them was William Howard Day, a free black, a graduate of Oberlin College, for a while a newspaper editor, who 5 years before had given up on America and settled in Canada. Before leaving, he had become involved with Martin R. Delaney and others who promoted the emigration of blacks to places outside of the United States. Delaney and his colleague, the Jamaican school teacher Robert Campbell, had visited Africa in 1859 and made an agreement with the Alake of Abeokuta to settle a colony of African Americans in the area. Their effort was supported by an interracial organization known as the African Civilization Society, which at the time was headed by Garnett. In 1859, they had accompanied the Reverend William King, the founder of the Buxton settlement in Canada, on a mission to Britain to raise funds for this settlement, a farming community made up of fugitive slaves in Canada, as Delaney and Campbell were on their way to Africa. They remained behind when King returned to Canada. Soon after King's departure, Delaney and Campbell arrived in England, eager to win financial support for their planned colony in Africa. Within weeks, supporters organized the African Aid Society to promote the interests of the colony and to raise funds for its establishment. Over the next few months, Day would become the public voice of this society. As he told a meeting of the Ladies, Negroes, Friends Society in Birmingham, the best method of doing away with slavery and of relieving England from the embarrassment would be the encouragement of the growth of cotton and the founding of a small British settlement on the coast of Africa. They and the society were appealing to the cherished free produce principle, which had so successfully animated the movement against West Indian slavery and which had seen a resurgence in the early 1850s. This is a movement that argues if you can produce cotton by free labor being, as it was argued, less expensive than slave labor, would lead ultimately to the collapse of a slave-based economy producing sugar. The economists in the room would know that this was totally fictitious, but that never stopped people. They was later joined by Garnett, who was there to promote the interests of the Civilization Society, and Campbell, who was on his way back to Africa, interestingly, not long after the British had occupied Lagos, their first foothold in the new colonial expansion in Africa in 1861. This is one of those strange historical coincidences. As far as Garnett and Campbell were concerned, the African Aid Society could help to achieve the objectives of undermining American slavery by encouraging the cultivation of cotton elsewhere, and at the same time bring civilization to the continent by expanding legitimate trade and Christianity. Once the people of Britain realized that the textile manufactured in Lancashire and Cheshire had been fanned with the size of the slaves, Garnett insisted, wet with his tears and stained with his blood, they would support the work of the society. All that was needed to initiate the effort was a small band of no more than a few teachers, a few settlers, including a carpenter, a blacksmith, a couple cotton planters, men who would have, as Garnett said, one hand on the Bible and the other on the plow. Campbell announced that he had already shipped cotton machinery to Lagos worth £250. But both Day and Garnett were careful to combine their free produce and settlement schemes with more politically charged attacks on the Confederacy. If the Union failed, Garnett told a meeting in Newcastle in November 1861, the hopes for emancipation would be dashed. He predicted with uncanny accuracy, however, that the slaves would be freed soon. They would remain in Britain until 1863, promoting the cause and raising funds for the establishment of a press in Canada. While they canvassed the north of England, other African Americans blanketed the rest of the country with frequent lectures and meetings, some of them including Henry Box Brown, the man who escaped in a box from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1848, marked "this side up," but whoever shipped the box, obviously the person couldn't read, and the box was turned upside down, and Brown arrived in Philadelphia a little worse for wear, but nonetheless it became one of those dramatic escapes by slaves in the antebellum period, and old Box Brown became much of a great showman, exploiting his efforts to reach freedom, and lived the rest of his life in England, by the way. Some of them included Henry Box Brown, James Watkins, William Craft, and William G. Allen, a free black who had been forced to flee the United States when he committed 2 cardinal errors that all professors should, at least one of them professors should know about. He planned to marry one of his students who happened to be white. And in liberal upstate New York, the local folks told him that they thought that was not a good idea. And they were about to tar and feather him, and he and his missus ran off to New York and then settled in England, where they ran schools in Ireland and England for a number of years. These men had been in Britain before the war. Others, such as J. Seller Martin, another fugitive slave, and Thomas Morris Chester, who in the Civil War in 1864 would become the first black correspondent of a white of a daily newspaper reporting from the James River front. Martin, Chester, and a man with the improbable name of William Andrew Jackson, we will talk more about him later, went to Britain specifically to campaign against the Confederacy. Still others, such as William Mitchell, were on a mission to raise money for fugitive slaves in Canada and used the opportunity to work against the Confederacy. There were also a few students studying at British University, William Watson, who attended King's College in London, and R.M. Johnson and C.J. Russell, who read medicine at Scottish universities and who took time off from their studies to promote the cause of the Union. They lectured throughout Britain, not just in areas affected by the cotton shortage. They, Craft, and Martin canvassed the west of England. Isaac Davidson, Jacob Green, Jackson and Day, Yorkshire, Mitchell, Benjamin Benson and Pennington, Wales, Craft and Garnett, northeast England, and Watson, Jackson, and Mitchell, the Midlands of England, to mention just a few. Some were affiliated with organized societies. As we have seen, Garnett and Day worked with the African Aid Society, Martin and Crafts with the London Emancipation Society. Jackson was employed for a few months as an agent of the Union and Emancipation Society, formed following a large public meeting in Manchester made up mainly of working men in December 1862. Others had no identifiable organizational affiliation. Henry Box Brown, who gained his name following his escape from Richmond, settled in Britain in the early 1850s. By the start of the war, his panoramas on American slavery, the Indian Mutiny, and the Civil War, which measured some 16,000 square feet, had generated considerable interest. He also lectured on the causes of the war and entertained his audiences with songs extolling the valor of fugitive slaves. Always inventive, Brown would later include a lecture on what in the 19th century was called electrobiology, and gave away gifts to children at each entertainment. But electrobiology is just simply magic. I don't know why it's called electrobiology. Jacob Green, the Kentucky fugitive, may have spoken for the others when he said that African Americans were the best judges of the horrors of slavery and knew best what were the principal causes of the war. But they did not speak with one voice about the significance of what was happening in the United States. Reverend William Mitchell, a free black who had settled in Toronto and was raising money for his church and school, insisted that slavery was doomed regardless of who won the war. The Reverend Nelson County of St. Catharines, Canada, was more apocryphal. or apocalyptic, white apocryphal too. The war, he proclaimed, would end and slavery would be abolished when God was satisfied that both sides were punished enough for their involvement in slavery. Edward Irving, the fugitive from New Orleans, who in 1856 had stowed away to England on board a ship laden with cotton, called for gradual abolition, wary that immediate emancipation would create unspecified problems both for the freedman and the society. Whatever the timing of emancipation, Thomas Morris Chester, who had emigrated to Liberia as a young man and who, as I said, in 1864 would become the first African American to report from a military front for a major American newspaper, believed that the war afforded African Americans an opportunity to come up to their full height of their manhood, to become agents of their own improvement. He said, "He whom the South had endeavored to rob of his rights and manhood had at once come up from the crouching position to the full stature of nature's nobleman, stepped into the ranks of the government at the call of the president, and now, to the astonishment of his former masters, kept step to liberty and the music of union." Lincoln's policies during the first year of the war almost undermined the efforts of Union supporters. His response to Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, seemed all of a piece with his reversal of General Fremont's and Hunter's proclamation freeing slaves in their military districts. Lincoln could claim with some justification that emancipation was outside the purview of field commanders, but his refusal to articulate a policy for freeing the slaves did the Union cause considerable harm and set in place the image of the president as a temporizer, an image he would find very hard to shake even after he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The best Union supporters could do was to insist that the president's hands were tied by constitutional restrictions. But such arguments struck many as unnecessarily arcane, especially so when, by his public declarations and actions, Lincoln seemed averse to freeing the slaves. Even among those who were willing to concede that the president had no power to move against slavery, there was a genuine sense of disbelief when his proposals to colonize free blacks in Central America and elsewhere were made public. One friendly editor dismissed the plan as impractical, chimerical, and as feasible as trying to send off the Normans or Saxons or Celtic elements of English society. James Watkins, a fugitive slave, issued a blistering condemnation of his attempt to deny black Americans their rights as citizens of America, a right that was conceded to them when their valor and blood was needed and shed in gaining the independence of that union over which Mr. Lincoln now presides. It was galling, undignified, demeaning, and totally impractical. He went on, "Men who were born free and others who had gained their emancipation, toiled and elbowed their way into position, some of ease and comfort, some of affluence, and most of them to respectability, must break up their homes, sever the dearest ties, throw their business to the winds, and go and meet a dark and ominous future in some remote and desolate highway between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean." The London Times, no lover of the Union cause, took particular pleasure in deriding what they call this scheme of philanthropic expatriation. The logic of the presidents was, the editor say, the old logic of the inquisitor who stretched his captive upon the rack and told them that it was entirely his own fault that he was in pain, because if he would change his religion, he would be immediately released. But these different views of the meaning and possible results of the war may have hindered, but they did not stymie the effectiveness of African American proponents of the Union. No one was more effective than William Andrew Jackson, who arrived in England in December 1862 with letters of introduction from William Lloyd Garrison and a number of prominent American Quakers, and was promptly hired as its agent by the Union and Emancipation Society. In the 9 months of his tour, in which he visited and lectured in most major towns, Jackson was a thorn in the side of the opposition. He brought to the agency credentials no one could match. He was the former coach driver of Jefferson Davis, from whom he escaped to Union forces around Fredericksburg as the Army of the Potomac made plans for an attack on Richmond in April 1862. His knowledge of conditions in the Confederate capital and the disposition of forces around the city were invaluable to Union officers who debriefed him before sending him on to Washington, D.C., and later to New York. Jackson was born on a plantation 37 miles outside Richmond in 1832. He was taken to the capital in 1845, where he was sold to a railway contractor who was also a substantial slaveholder. Like so many other urban slaves, Jackson was hired out first to a doctor and then a tobacco manufacturer, a commissioned merchant, and finally as a messenger at the Richmond courthouse. During many of these stints, he worked as a hackney cab driver. In fact, his cab was in the procession that snaked its way through the city during the visit of the Prince of Wales in 1860. In 1861, the person for whom he drove sold out his business, and Jackson was hired out on a monthly basis until August 1861, when he was hired by Jefferson Davis. The contract with Davis was renewed for 1 year in December 1861 for $250, Davis guaranteeing to pay an additional $800 should Jackson die or run away before the end of the contract. Jackson fled 4 months later. Jackson brought an unmatched legitimacy to the Union cause. Union supporters vied for his presence at their meeting. Here was a person who knew Davis firsthand and who must have overheard the conversation of the leaders of the rebellion. Other African Americans had framed the image of the Confederate president as an anti-hero. To J. Seller Martin, Davis was like Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, who, as he said, raised an impious war in heaven to gratify the aspirations of his inordinate ambition, that he might keep forever those that believed in his sway behind his triumphal car of sin and death. But Martin's assessment was much too cerebral for the taste of most audiences. Jackson was more direct and personal. He said there was no greater enemy of his race than Jeff Davis. He had never met anyone who had worked more zealously to keep his race and the poor white trash, as he called them, in bondage. It was a theme Jackson drove home at every stop, especially to the large working class crowds who flocked to the meetings at which he spoke. This was a war, he insisted, that had a direct bearing on the interest and future of both African Americans as well as the white working classes in the US and in Britain. Jackson attended and spoke at dozens of meetings throughout Britain, sometimes returning to areas in an effort to counter the claims of pro-Confederate supporters. Most of these appearances were sponsored by the Union and Emancipation Society and their local auxiliaries, and involved Jackson teaming up with some of the society's other lecturers. Soon after his arrival, he was taken under the wing of George Thompson, the most widely identified abolitionist in the country. Together, they toured the West Country, the home counties, and the north of England. On other occasions, he partnered with Peter Sinclair. But wherever he went, Jackson quickly became the main focus of attention. His appeal and success were to a large extent the result of his ability to personalize the issues central to the war, as well as to speak to larger political issues. Were not slaves, he frequently asked, entitled to the same freedoms he and his audiences now enjoyed? When opponents claimed that conditions faced by the working class in England were no better than those the slaves encountered, he addressed his working class audiences directly. Could a master here, he would ask, take a workman's children and sell them? Could he separate a man from his own family? Here they could go to school. But if a man was caught teaching a Negro a letter in the southern states, he would be fined and sent to prison. To those who argued that if the South were allowed to leave, they would soon come to the realization that slavery was unprofitable and so emancipate the slaves, Jackson pointed to the fact that when the country was established, there were only 750,000 slaves. Now there were 4 million. He wondered, tongue-in-cheek, how much time would be needed before the slaveholders realized their system was unprofitable. On other occasions, he met the criticism of Lincoln's emancipation policy with a detailed defense of the president's approach, limited as it was by both constitutional powers and the realities of sectional politics. But for Jackson, the issues turned on the slaves' demonstrated hunger for freedom. When John Brown was hung, he reported, the slaves said that his spirit would never die, nor did it die, for the spirit of John Brown walked about all over the country. The urge to be free, he believed, came naturally and had little to do with the type of treatment slaves received. After all, he pointed out, he was treated well, yet he yearned for freedom. He was fond of saying, a bird could sing in a cage if people would keep him well. But if they turned him out, he asked, would he go back again? The answer seemed self-evident and needed no amplification. The outcome of the struggle, he reiterated wherever he spoke, would determine the future of the United States. If, he said, the Republic lived, slavery must die. And if slavery triumphed, the Republic must die. Local reporters thought his speeches were both forceful and humorous. He was fond of telling audiences that following his escape, he had written Davis to say how sorry he was to have forced him to forfeit the $250 bond he had posted to ensure Jackson's return to his owner. As he knew, he would say money was very scarce in the South and provisions high. But his engagement in London, he wrote Davis, would not on any account permit him to return. But Jackson's ease on the platform, his sense of humor, and his eloquence raised questions among opponents about the veracity of his life story. How, they asked, could someone who only escaped slavery in April 1862 develop such a command of the platform and the details of the war in so short a time? Similar questions were asked of Douglass when he first appeared on the stump in England 20 years earlier. But he responded convincingly that he had been schooled by supporters in the years since his escape. Jackson could make no such claim. More importantly, since Douglass's visit in 1845, Britain had seen the emergence of racial views which questioned the tenets of racial equality that undergirded the abolitionist movement. Day thought he could discern a distinct change in the 2 years since his arrival in 1859. Jackson lamented that he could go nowhere without meeting with some prejudice, and thought that there was quite as much prejudice in England as there was in America. William Watson, a Kentuckian and former student at King's College London, was scheduled to give a lecture in Blackburn in December 1864 on the topic, The Bible, Trades, the Education of Blacks, and the American War and its Future Events, a relatively uncontroversial topic. Much to his and the local organizers' surprise, Watson was attacked outside the lecture hall. There is no doubt that supporters of the Confederacy had set out to disrupt the lecture rather than to attack Watson physically. but the situation quickly got out of hand. Watson was kicked, his coat torn, and as more than one observer reported, he was racially insulted. The attack convinced one local editor that the hatred of the Negro is not confined to either the North or the South. John Brooks, an African American who had been living and working in a little town near Glasgow, Scotland, for some time, and who had been asked by Lincoln to present the Stars and Stripes to the New Mills Anti-Slavery Society as a gesture of friendship, accused the British press of ignoring the brutality slaves face when trying to leave plantations. Instead, they chose, he said, to keep in view the thoughts of the blacks polluting their masters' wives and making a wholesale butchery of their innocent children. All the evidence suggests that Jackson and other African-American proponents of the Union had to swim against the tide of accelerating racism, which only complicated their efforts to undermine the legitimacy of the Confederacy in the eyes of the British public. In his second visit to Britain in 1859, Douglass thought such negative views of the potential of blacks were the results of the increasing number of Southern visitors to Britain and the growing popularity of minstrelsy. When I was a student in London in the 1960s, the longest running show in the West End of London was the minstrel show. So it was still, people were still paying money to see that strange business. In 1863, William Craft felt compelled to launch an attack on the views of leaders of the London Anthropological Society, whose association with the agent of the Confederacy, the chief propagandist for the Confederacy in Britain, was indisputable. The Society's objective, this agent had written, was to question what he called the heresies that have gained currency in science and politics of the equality of the races of men. In a letter inviting the agent to join the Society, James Hunt, one of the founders of the Society, wrote, "You should and must take a strong interest in our objects. For in us is your only hope that the Negro's place in nature will ever be scientifically ascertained and fearlessly explained." Craft took direct aim at these views in a speech before the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was held in Newcastle. Craft had just returned from a visit to Dahomey in West Africa, where he had gone to encourage the cultivation of cotton and to open a school. One newspaper editor thought Craft effectively countered the anthropologist's insult to humanity. Hunt of the Anthropological Society thought otherwise, dismissing Craft's argument as nothing more than poetical claptrap. They may not always have sung in the same key. Sometimes they were clearly out of tune with one another. But by and large, the duet between African Americans and their various publics in Britain were harmonious and, more importantly, effective. There's no doubt that their presence proved indispensable to the effort to counter the claims of the Confederacy. Early in the war, Lord Brougham, the old man of British anti-slavery, had questioned both the merits of going to war and the Union's objectives. An acquaintance tried to allay Brougham's concern. In conversations with African Americans, he said, he had come to the conclusion that all believed that the war would lead ultimately to emancipation. Martin had informed him that secession was nothing more than an attempt to protect slavery. Craft argued that the hopes of blacks rested with the Union. If the Confederacy succeeded, their conditions would be infinitely worse. Garnett pointed to the fact that with Confederate success would come the reopening of the slave trade. Finally, in letters to friends, Alexander Crummell had written from Liberia that if he were in England, he would strive to show that the future of freedom for the slaves rests with the Union. Brougham's friend pointed to positive signs coming out of Washington. Haiti and Liberia had been recognized as independent countries. The laws against the slave trade were being enforced. The confiscation acts pointed to a better future, as was the call for emancipation in the District of Columbia. He concluded, let the black man have a hearing, and he will convince all candid minds that free trade in the mouths of slaveholding politicians means free trade in Negroes and nothing more. All the evidence suggests that what African Americans said about the contending forces mattered to the British public. For over 30 years, they had kept alive the message of the need for emancipation in the United States to large audiences, especially those made up of the working classes. Years later, while he was awaiting execution for his involvement in the Haymarket bombings in Chicago, and I suppose this is not a very good example, but for the Haymarket bombings in Chicago, Samuel Fielding, who had grown up in the small town of Todmorden, which straddles the county lines between Lancashire and Yorkshire, reminisced about the many lectures he attended as a young boy, the frequent visits of what he called colored lecturers who spoke on the slavery question in America. They had, he recalled, a very great effect on my mind, and I could hardly divest myself of their impressions. And I used to frequently find myself among my playmates dilating much upon the horrors of slavery. He remembered that every night during the summer, following lecturers, groups of men would congregate on the streets and at prominent corners, discussing the latest news and forecasting the next. And in these groups, he said, there were always to be heard the advocates and champions of both sides. Some, like the unemployed cotton worker from Clitheroe, walked miles to hear the lectures of African Americans, and when he could not eagerly read reports of them in local newspapers. But if Fielding were to be believed, the supporters of the Union usually carried the day. In spite of the efforts of supporters of the Confederacy, Jackson and other African Americans had a profound effect on British public opinion. Sabrina Eastman, the Chicago abolitionist, and during the war, the American Council in Bristol, best captured the significance of the impact they had on British public opinion when he said of Jackson, he was quite a sharp person and makes some telling hits, and as a colored man is here always an oracle. There is no gainsaying him. It is unclear to what extent their efforts influenced British policy, as Quarles has suggested, but there is no doubt that they had a profound effect on British public opinion. They helped to keep the cause of the war alive in the minds of many thousands who came out to their meetings and lectures, and in so doing influence the way the war was seen by the British public. In this regard, they sang with one voice and in harmony. Thank you.